Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. As you can see, I'm joining from our University of Washington library, virtually, of course. I would have actually liked to be in Lisbon right now, but here we are. But I want to thank the organizers for still going ahead with this workshop and doing a great job. And it seems like it's been already successful so far. And so congratulations to the workshop organizers. Thanks for all the participants for working through this new format in this just quick turnaround in the last few weeks. So I hope you're enjoying yourself even in this lockdown, and thank you for joining for this talk. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully, again, somebody will tell me if that didn't work. Okay. Giovanni or somebody can please confirm that
yes, that's totally fine. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Just, you know, the only problem with this format is I have no idea what anyone is looking at and what they look like. So hopefully the organizers will tell me if there's something that's not working right. Anyway, so what I want to do in this talk, three things. One is just kind of quickly give a brief introduction to some of the concepts. This is to the benefit of people who are kind of new in this area, and you know, and also kind of just trying to get us all on the same kind of a platform. The second thing is I will describe some of the recent experiments that we've done in this space, and they're ongoing. There are still things we are learning and exploring, but I want to share those with you in the hope that maybe there's some feedback, some discussion. And third is to challenge all of us to kind of get to our next kind of agenda in this space, right? So I want to start by just drawing out some issues in general field of machine learning, AI, and then going into more specific to search and recommendation related to bias. I'll then connect this idea of bias to fairness. And there's not always a direct connection, but I'll show how we can use this notion of fairness to either control or counteract bias, because bias is not always a bad thing. It's not always unintentional, but you know, if you're not acting against bias, can we control it? Can we at least understand it better? And then linking it to the fairness idea. And then, as I said, I'll describe some experiments. The bottom line that hopefully I'll be able to convey you here today is we should accept that many or most ML systems are biased in different ways. Search and recommendation systems have their own biases. And this notion of marketplace that allows us to control and counteract bias. So this is kind of thing that I will introduce and I'll talk about a little bit. So hopefully that's a takeaway. And one way to do so, one way to address this bias and bring some diversity, bring some fairness in the marketplace is through diversity, which is one of the ways you can do that. And then I'll kind of try to connect it back to what I call responsible AI, where we are looking at not just fairness, but also these related concepts of transparency, accountability, and ethics. Of course, you know, we won't have a chance to really go deeper into any all of these things, but I just want to point out that these things are related, and you can't just talk about bias in isolation. You can't talk about fairness in isolation. You have to consider all these other related things. So let's start by just taking a couple of examples from machine learning, and I'm sure you've probably seen these examples, but I just want to point them out as a quick introduction to, look, these things happen, and they happen for a few specific reasons. Either there is bias in our data that we are using for training machine learning models, or there is bias in some way in our algorithms that we are using for working through this. So here's sort of a popular example where this system is designed to predict an existing criminal or convicted felon who would have conviction again in the future. And it was found that this algorithm was incorrectly predicting people of color to be repeat offenders, more so than the people, white people, right? So this was, the reason was it was using the prejudice that we already had in our data and making the predictions based on that. Here's another example. This system was designed to judge beauty contests. Again, you can question why would somebody want to do this, and this is one of the things that I'll actually come back to toward the end also, that often we are too excited about what AI could do and not asking enough about what AI should do. But anyway, AI could do this, so we did it, and it was found that it was mostly preferring white female of certain characteristics as beautiful, right? And again, this is based on our own prejudice that's found in the data. Here's an example. This was actually a couple of years ago in this paper, so it's probably resolved now, but if you see here where you put she is a doctor, he's a nurse in English, translated to Turkish, put Turkish and translate back to English, it comes out that he's a doctor, she's a nurse, right? So there is this implicit bias, gender-based bias in our data, right, that associates he to doctor more and then she to nurse more, right? And so, and I'm sure this is probably resolved by now, but this was a couple of years ago. Similarly, a few years ago, this was based on our word embeddings, where you can see the extreme gender-based associations, where with he, you have maestro, skipper, protege, philosopher, and so on. Whereas for the female, you have homemaker, nurse, receptionist, librarian, and so on, right? So these things are present in our data, right? So there are things that are based on our data or based on our algorithms. But let's take a closer look at search and recommendation. And there also we see biases of different kinds, predominantly biases because of the data that we have and because of the algorithms that we use. Here's an example of bias because of data. And again, this was a couple of years ago. If you search for CEOs for the image search, as you can see, most or all in this case, CEOs are male, most of them are white. And so this kind of gives you an idea that if this is what CEOs look like, right? And the reason this is, we're getting this results is because if you look at Fortune 500 companies, most of the CEOs are male, most of them are white, right? And so in a way, you can't blame the system. It's just retrieving what's available, but we have to acknowledge that this bias exists. But then there are times the way the system, the algorithm are designed such in such a way that that introduces bias. So if you were to query NASA, and again, this was a data example because these things keep changing all the time, right? And so as people, they encounter problems, they fix it, and we move on. But even if this doesn't happen from NASA query, I'm sure it would happen for some other queries. So in this particular case, if you were to search for NASA, the top results in YouTube you'll get have actually nothing to do with NASA. But as you can see, they are related to some conspiracy theory that is intriguing, right? And so the way these things surface as the top results is at some point when people were searching for NASA, these videos were also presented as sponsored results or somewhere toward the bottom of the list, but that caught people's attention. So they clicked on it and the algorithm incorrectly interpreted that this was relevant to NASA, right? And so then it started kind of surfacing it even further up, and then people clicked more on it and so on. So this is the way the algorithm is designed here, is associating clicks to relevance, and that kind of creates this feedback loop that allows the algorithm to keep boosting these results even more and incorrectly interpreting that the reason people are clicking on these is because they're relevant. They're not relevant, but hey, that looks interesting, let me check it out. And so even though I was looking for NASA related things, I'm gonna click on it. Here's another example. This happened in the US in 2016 for our presidential elections. And you can see the sampling of the top 20 stories, election related stories. And this was manually kind of analyzed, that these are the 20 stories. And when you look at the engagement related to those 20 stories, Some of these 20 stories were actual news, others were fake news. They were not real news, but they were made up to catch people's attention and misinform them. And you can see from February of 2016 to the election day, which was in November, the mainstream news in those 20 kind of kept declining in terms of engagement, and the fake news started kind of spiking up, right? So again, the reason this is happening is because those fake news, they have certain characteristics. They catch attention. They seem sensational, and people are more likely to click on it, even though that they're not looking for this, even though that is not true. And because our algorithms are designed in a way that we interpret clicks as a way for, as a feedback for relevance. And so this kind of gets fed back into this. And of course, you can find a lot of these examples. You know, you find it in this auto completion kind of thing. So why Black women are, and of course, people have done this for other examples. And then you see Google or other search engines auto completion. What are the common things? And you can see that the way the system has done this association, nobody has manually put these things, but this is how system has learned. And then you come out with weird examples like this. Now, why is this problematic? So system does it. You can't kind of blame the system because it's just learning from our behavior. Data has our prejudice, but hey, that's our collective knowledge. The biases have always been there. The prejudice have always been there. Why is this problematic now? Why are we paying attention? Well, let's take a look at what happens in a typical search engine. So this is a click-through graph for the top 10 results in Google. And not surprisingly, you can see that the top result gets clicked a fair number of time. And then the clicks decrease exponentially almost as you go to second result, third result. And by the time you get to the 10th result, it's barely 1%. And of course, people are not even going to the second page or third page. Now, this may actually seem like a good thing because that means we've designed a good system where all the relevant stuff are found at the top and people don't have a need to go to the bottom of the list. However, the reality is different. As I mentioned before, people are clicking on things not just because they're relevant, but because they may be sensational, but because they have some other characteristics that catch their eyes. And we are incorrectly interpreting this as signal for relevance. And then our algorithms are designed based on our assumptions from before, where we think, oh, this is a good signal, this is a positive signal, so let's keep boosting these results because that actually meets the needs, right? So if you look at what our models were before, this model of relevance with this relevance feedback incorporated into ranking it, well, that's actually no longer true. Those things are now murky. And then because we kind of keep pushing this result at the top, people have this kind of association, right? And you can't kind of often hear that they believe something is true because they found it on Google, because they found it at the top of the list, and they believe something doesn't exist because Google couldn't retrieve it in the top 10 results, right? And so this is more than just relevant. This is our perception about what's true and what's not, what's out there and what's not, right? And so this creates unfair distribution of opportunities and resources. And scholars have been talking about this for the last several years now. This creates this cognitive effect, right? And cognitive bias is another important kind of bias beyond data bias and algorithmic bias, because this is something that people have the perception about. They believe something or don't believe in something because of these characteristics. So this is a serious problem, right? So even though we were already biased before even the search engines existed, we already had our prejudices, but now they get embedded into everything that we use. And we are using a lot of this. So this is a problem. There are obvious reasons for us to care about this because it's the right thing to do. We need to fix this because it's the right thing to do. Obviously, that reason is often not enough because maybe as academics, that's enough for us. We want to do this, but policymakers, well, they need to know that if you don't fix this, well, it leads to people being misinformed, making bad decisions. But even that may not be enough for big corporations, so they need to understand that there is actually a little bit more than this. So I spent some time at Spotify, and we talked about these things because some of us were really interested in this topic, and we talked about the algorithmic bias and data bias and so on. But that wasn't enough. But what really convinced Spotify to invest in this research is that addressing this bias and bringing fairness in the platform was actually good for the sustainability of the service. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Beyond that, it's also actually good for your bottom line. And so last year I spent some time at Amazon, and again, this was something where you can see that as you diversify, as you bring in more fairness to your recommendation, this wasn't just some right thing to do or good thing to do. It actually had a direct impact on your bottom line, right? So there are many reasons for us to control or counteract the bias and bring fairness. So let's talk about that fairness. And I'm going to bring this fairness idea in this notion of marketplace. But before we get to that, let's just quickly think about what's fair. Now, this is a tricky notion, and I welcome feedback from the community, and I would also acknowledge that we don't have one definition that we can all agree on, and neither should we actually, and then I'll come back to that. But people have been talking about what's fair for a long time, and not just in general in the humanities, because fairness, of course, has been a concept for a long time. For centuries, philosophers have talked about that. But more recently in the computer kind of technology domain, people talked about fairness as a way to counteract bias. And what kind of bias? A bias that's systematically and unfairly discriminate against certain individuals or groups, right? And that's why often when you talk about fairness, it's there are two kind of ways to talk about it. It's individual fairness and group fairness. It's what's fair to an individual and what's fair as a group. For the purpose of this talk and most of my work, I'll be referring to group fairness, right? And so this is where we want to see what's fair for as an entire kind of community rather than just for some individuals. More recently, Ricardo Baez and many others have talked about fairness and bias in the web. And again, they talk about data bias, algorithmic bias, and cognitive bias. Among other biases, there are all kinds of, there are device-based biases, there are geographic biases, there are activity biases, and so on. But data, algorithm, and cognitive biases often are the three major kind of biases in the web setting. Even more specific to search setting, people have talked about, well, what's fair? Well, fair is, again, counteracting bias. And how do you do that? Well, one way to do that in information retrieval kind of a setting or recommendation setting is to make sure that people have exposure to a diverse kind of information, diverse kind of documents, recommendations, items, objects, and so on. And specifically, they talk about these three kinds of ways to do so, with three kind of ways to bring fairness or counteract bias. One is statistical parity, where however many groups you have, you say, well, each of them needs to have equal exposure, right? And so you have male CEOs and female CEOs. If you're presenting the top 10 results, there should be 5 male CEOs and 5 female CEOs. Disparate impact, on the other hand, says, well, every group should have exposure, but it should be proportional to their size. So if 80% CEOs are male, then there should be 8 out of 10 results for male CEO and 2 for female CEOs. Whereas disparate treatment says, well, we need to treat groups differently. So you might say, well, historically, we've shown mostly male CEOs, and we want to change that. We want to show people that there are female CEOs. So we want to highlight that. So let's give different treatment to this protected group or special group, right? And so these are ways you can think about bringing or addressing bias and bringing fairness. But there are lots of other ways to do that, and you can look up this publication by Narayan about 21 different definitions of fairness. But you can keep looking even more, right? So the bottom line is there are many ways we can think about fairness, Many of those definitions are linked to bias, but there's not always that direct connections. Right? And there are also these related concepts of diversity, novelty. And so how do you kind of think about this? Right? So let me just quickly summarize the way at least we think about them. And these are not universal definitions. So we think about bias as skewed exposure with respect to certain attributes, right? So we talked about bias towards white male for CEOs, right? And so that shows that skewness of exposure, right? Because you saw the search results and it shows only male CEOs, most of them are white. Diversity is often a way to counteract that by bringing in the other aspects also. So first you have to recognize that there are other aspects, that it's not just male CEOs, there are also other kinds of CEOs, but they're probably not as well represented. So diversity, essentially you're recognizing that and you're also bringing those in your exposure. Novelty is something that IR community has dealt with for a long time, and it looks at how much redundancy you have in what you're presenting, right? So if you're looking at, and this is very common, you're looking at the top 10 results or top whatever results, being able to say, well, how much they are different from each other. So they may all be relevant, but are they bringing something different? And so that's removing redundancy within the group. And fairness is a subjective thing. Often it's tied to, as I said, reducing bias or removing bias, bringing diversity, bringing novelty, but it's not always a direct connection. And one example that I often give my students is taxation system, right? So if you are in a country where you have income tax, chances are it's not a linear model. Those who are rich, they get taxed at a higher rate. Those who are not doing so well, they don't get taxed at all. And people in the middle have some kind of equation, right? So you can say, well, according to this definition of bias, this is a skewed exposure, right? This is a bias system, but we believe it to be a fair system, that it is fair that rich pay more than those who are not, right? And again, this is something that we don't all agree on. So if you ask, is this fair? Some people will agree, some people will not. And tomorrow we'll have a different fair system and another day. So again, the notion of fairness keeps changing, but you can definitely say that it is bias, but it is intentional bias, right? So here the fair system is not to remove bias, but to have the right kind of bias. So we find this in many kind of things. Okay, so now let's talk about the marketplace. So this is actually becoming very common, especially in industry setting where you have a platform that has to balance both the sides or multiple sides. So here you have consumer who's consuming the content. So let's say the content provider is Spotify. So you have consumer who's a listener, and then you have content suppliers who are artists, right? Or studios. And if you want to keep your consumers happy or satisfied, then you give them suggestions about all the hottest artists and the popular music, or if you're Netflix, again, the most popular movies, and that will keep them happy. But that's not good for the content suppliers, because those artists, those studios, well, there's only going to be only the top 1% or so that's hot right now. What happens to the rest of the artists or the studios, the movies or the streams? Well, they don't get exposure. And that's not good to them, because if they get paid based on how much people consume, so they're not going to get paid, and that gives them not enough motivation to continue producing or being on your platform, right? Now, if you want to keep them happy, give everybody the same exposure, then 99% of the things that you're recommending to the consumers is not the popular, not the hot thing. And so that's going to affect their satisfaction. So you have to balance both of these sides to keep both of them relatively happy, relatively going with your platform. This comes up in, of course, all this Netflix, Spotify, those kind of streaming platforms, but also in general ads, right? So you have the ads provider and you have the consumers who are consuming your content and also seeing ads. You don't want to overload them with too many ads, and you also can't afford not to have ads. So how do you balance this? So this is a case of multi-objective optimization. You're trying to optimize for all that are involved, and this brings us to that group fairness. What can you do? What balance can you get that will not hurt too much each of them, but it's also not going to make each of them or any of them completely happy. So I'll quickly describe some experiments that we did in our attempts, and these are some preliminary experiments, so they're still ongoing, to try to balance this, to bring some fairness, but not sacrifice relevance or satisfaction. So what we did, we took a sliver of search data. So that means we had some queries, and for each of those queries, we took the top results. There are 100 results. Those 100 results for each query, we clustered them. So here, you can cluster things, or you can identify or group things differently, right? So the CEO example, male CEO, female CEO, or white CEO, and CEO of color. But we were not going for those kind of protected characteristics. We just went for topical diversity. So we clustered the results in topical clusters. And then using some different algorithms, we created the top 10, or we re-ranked the top 10 results. And I'll come back to this. And we were looking at fairness in two ways: statistical parity and disparate impact. Okay. So this work was done by my PhD student at Rutgers University and Royan Gao, and we have a couple of publications in the last few months that, if you're interested, this is where you can find the details. But what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick overview of what was done and what we got. So we had two data sets. One we obtained from Google, and this was looking at Google Trends. So the 100 queries in that specific time. And this is what the queries look like. So these are the queries that were kind of trending in that duration. And for each of the queries, we retrieved the top 100 results. And that was our data set. Another data set we used was from Track. This was a New York Times data set, and that had 50 queries. And for, again, each of the queries, we retrieved the top 100 results using BM25 algorithm. And we did the typical clustering of k-means. We use different metrics for measuring bias and fairness. And again, you can have other ways to do so. We use degree of bias, and this is it's an entropy-based measure, and we assume that lower the bias, is higher the fairness. So as you talk about increasing fairness, essentially we're talking about lowering the degree of bias, right? And again, here we are making the direct connection, but as I said, it's not always the case that higher fairness means lowering the bias. And then we had this other measures that combine relevance and diversity or novelty. And these are well-established measures in the literature that I won't describe here, but you can see that we had different measures for doing those four concepts that I described before: the bias, fairness, diversity, novelty, right? And specifically combining diversity and novelty with relevance. So we didn't want to just look at relevance and just novelty, but there has to be something that combines them all. So I'm going to walk you through kind of visually what we did. The details, again, can be found in those papers. So this is what we're trying to do. We had the top 100 results for a given query, and we are trying to reconstruct the top 10 results, because this is what gets exposed to the users, right? So, and those top 100 results came from two subtopics: the blue one and the red one, right? So you have blue kind of aspect and the red kind of aspect. And as you combine them in some ways for the top 10, if you're looking at statistical parity, then you need to give equal exposure to both blue and red, right? So you need 5 blue and 5 red in your top 10. If you're doing disparate impact, then you find that in the 100, you have 70 of them are blue and 30 of them are red. So when you're constructing top 10, you need 7 blue and 3 red. The problem is, this is a ranking problem, not a classification or clustering problem, right? And so here, if you simply just put 5 blue and 5 red, or 7 blue and 3 red, well, you're disregarding the relevance information, right? Because the ranking matters. So we need to not simply dump things like that. You need to also kind of consider the rank. So here's what we do. So one approach is what we call top-top with statistical parity. So here we want to achieve statistical parity. That means equal number of blue and red, but we consider the rank. So what we do is we go through our 100 results, pick the top 5 blue, and pick the top 5 red, and then move them to the top 10 results rank in that order, right? So we preserve the rank, the relative rank of blues and red, and this is what we can come up with, right? So this is the result of top-top with statistical parity. If you're doing similarly top-top with disparate impact, you need the 7 top blue and 3 top red. And again, you construct the top 10 list with those ranks preserved, right? So as you can see, we achieve a different top 10 list, and it's a question of which one is better, but we'll come back to that. The problem with this, so this looks, of course, better than what we were doing before, but the problem with this is we're still picking things from the top 10 or 15, and they may not have as much novelty, right? And so we also want to kind of diversify a little bit and bring in a little bit more novelty. So then we improve upon the statistical parity by doing page-wise. So now we go through the tops in each of these pages, right? And so we go through the first 5 pages and pick only one blue from each of them, the top blue. And then we do the same thing with the red. And again, construct the top 10 using this rank information. Disparate impact, we go through 7 pages to get the blue and 3 pages to get the red. And again, preserve the rank to construct the top 10. So that's also kind of hopefully better. But the problem is it's still kind of just looking at a sliver of the overall data to sample from it. We're not really still looking at what's all available to us. And so then we turn to epsilon greedy algorithm. So this has been used in many other contexts. And typically the way it is done is epsilon is a value between 0 and 1 that indicates amount of exploration you want to do, right? And so epsilon is explore the results with epsilon probability and exploit with 1 minus epsilon probability. So what does it mean? If you set epsilon to 0, that means no exploration. That means take what Google is giving you and do exactly that. So that's pure exploitation. If you have epsilon set to 1, then it's full exploration. That means you just randomly sample from the 100 results you have available. But of course, we can pick something in between. So a naive way to do this is what we call the naive epsilon greedy, where we say with epsilon probability, do exploration. And with 1 minus epsilon, pick from the top that Google is giving you, right? And you can tune this parameter epsilon, how much exploration, how much you want to kind of look around in the rest of the 100 results, and how much you want to just get the top. But we can also do slightly better because we have identified the underlying clusters, right? So how do we use that information? So we modify this to what we call the fair epsilon greedy. We say with the epsilon probability, do exploration. And here, exploration is not randomly selecting from 100 results, but randomly picking a cluster, right? And then from that cluster, pick the top within that cluster. Or you can, and 1 minus epsilon, pick the fair cluster, right? So the fairness here is determined using whether using statistical parity or disparate impact. And then from that cluster, the right kind of cluster, we pick the top. So I'll just quickly now get to the results. This is what Google search results show. So the first column is degree of bias. The lower, the better. The next 3 columns are those measures of relevance and novelty combined. The higher, the better. Right? If you use the greedy algorithm, epsilon greedy, as you can see, the 0.0 epsilon greedy means it's going to do exactly what Google did, right? And in that case, the numbers are the same. If it's 1 greedy, that means it's going to do randomization, randomly exploring, in which case the degree of bias goes down, but other things, the relevance, novelty combination, is actually not so good. But when you do the statistical fair algorithm, fair epsilon greedy with statistical parity and disparate impact, you can see that we're able to reduce the degree of bias by quite a bit. And at the same time, and this is interesting, that we're able to boost some of the scores for relevance and novelty combined. Right? And the similar things happens with the track data also, where we use BM25 for ranking. Again, the non-fair or naive epsilon greedy does something, but the statistical parity or disparate impact, the fair epsilon greedy achieves better results in terms of not just the degree of bias, so reducing degree of bias, increasing fairness, but also the combination of relevance and novelty, improving on those things. So this was kind of encouraging because it wasn't simply increasing the fairness or decreasing bias, but also improving the combination of that diversity and relevance. If you, in a way, it's easy to do diversity, right? Because you can just do random exploration and you're going to have a lot of diversity, but it doesn't always help with fairness, right? And this is kind of a subtle point here that generally speaking, yeah, diversity is good, but it doesn't, in this case, the way the fairness is defined, which is the degree of bias, it doesn't always help. We found the statistical parity with epsilon greedy is generally the best. We still don't know a number of things. So we went with 2 clusters here, but why 2? Why not 5? Why not 7? We don't know. And this is still related to topical diversity. You can imagine there are all kinds of other diversity you can think about. The fairness measure, we went with degree of bias. Well, there could be many others. And so, and we still don't know if this really addresses the big problem of misinformation, right? So I give examples of how because things are biased, people get exposed to this and then be misinformed. Well, imagine if you remove that bias and now we are bringing diversity, there's still an extra step to see if it has an impact on people being correctly informed now. I want to mention one last thing here before I wrap up. So we are continuing some of these experiments and we designed this little game and you can look it up. There is a URL at the bottom here, tinyurl.com/Google or not. So here we are challenging people to figure out if they can find which rank list came from Google. And so this is what they get to see. So for the same query, there are 2 rank lists are presented. One is directly from Google and one is modified by one of our algorithms. And so the challenge is pick one that you think is from Google. And this is kind of surprisingly hard because most of the results are similar, but there's typically 1 or 2 results that are different, and then it's you kind of figure out, or you have to kind of decide if that's actually significant enough, different enough, and which one you like better, right? So these experiments are still ongoing, but as you can see, so one of these, and actually I don't even know which one is from Google and which one is not, but the one that's not from Google is designed, ranked using our epsilon greedy algorithm, right? And so epsilon 0.3. So far we have found that people can differentiate between original Google results and the results that are prepared using our epsilon greedy algorithm, right? So in other words, we're able to bring in some diversity, reduce some bias or increase some fairness without sacrificing people's preference or satisfaction. So if we assume that people prefer the most relevant results to them, then the fairer results are indistinguishable from Google. But of course, there is a limit to how far you can stretch this. So 0.3 is okay, 0.5 also, but then if you get it to 0.9, that's too far, because now you start seeing a lot of things that are from the bottom of the top 100 results and people kind of don't like it. So, but the thing is, there is a room for improvement here, right? And we can find some threshold where we're not sacrificing people's satisfaction, but still giving them more diverse results. And so this is, again, going back to, it's a simple experiment, but addresses that marketplace idea. All right, so I'm gonna wrap this up quickly. I hope I've convinced you, maybe I haven't, that we are all biased. The biases have existed for a long time in us. It's not just in the system. And you can read this book or many other things that shows you that you know, we are still good people, but we still have hidden biases. So it's not surprising that our data sets have those prejudices, those biases expressed in that, and now our systems are learning from it. And so any data set can be biased, and because of our existing biases that have existed for centuries, and this data sets, any model can be biased because of that, right? When we have this data sets created, when we build some models, there are assumptions, there are trade-offs that we do. So on top of the existing biases and prejudices we have our own assumptions on top of it. And often these are not expressed, these are not intentional, and so all of these cause bias. The way to go forward, the first thing I think, we need to acknowledge this. We need to accept this. We need to educate people. We need to be aware of this. We not only have to quantify, but also qualify. So often, as you see in our work also, we are worried too much about quantifying different things. But I think there is still room for qualifying. What exactly, how do we think about fairness? Right? And that requires engaging communities that are not just a small community of IR or computer science. This is a personal thing. This is a subjective thing. It's not something that we should aim to have one universal definition and accept it and force it somehow. This is going to be dependent on the culture, the country, on many other factors. We should also not think about just solving this using some other algorithm, right? So we have problems with algorithmic bias, and another algorithm to solve that is not going to be a way forward. So we need to think deeper because otherwise we're going to be just in the circular problems. Okay. So going forward, our big challenges, I think, are three categories. One is, as I said, we still need to keep thinking about this terminology and definitions and discuss them, not to come up with the universal definitions, but through those discussions, new understanding will emerge, right? New conceptual leaps will happen. So we need that. We also, of course, need experimental setups, new data sets, evaluation metrics, right? And so many people are working on it. Track is doing the FAIR track that they're launching soon. The data set is coming out, but we need a lot of those efforts. And often these experiments we do in lab setting or in control setting are not sufficient to really make an impact. So we still need to think about how do we integrate these algorithms, these data sets, these experiments we've done into actual practical systems in production level systems, and iterate through it. Like we still have to keep learning from it, from real people, through real experiments. So I think that's also a set of challenges that we need to address. So with that, I actually want to end here because we're over time and open up for any questions.